In a Chicago courtroom, a black woman stands silently as a white officer unleashes a brutal kick. Yet she rises not as a victim but as his newly appointed police chief. This is a saga of corruption, reckoning, and unwavering resistance that will profoundly challenge your understanding of justice. Dear viewer, what unfolds next isn't merely a scandal. It's a profound battle for the soul of an entire city and a relentless pursuit of justice in places often overlooked. If this is your first visit, I warmly invite you to share your viewing location in the comments below. And if narratives like this move you, challenge you, or spark your thoughts, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We amplify voices that deserve to be heard daily. Thank you for joining us. Now let's delve into the story. Under the stark, cold light of the Cook County Courthouse, the atmosphere was unusually still, almost hushed, as if the very walls anticipated the unfolding drama. Inside Courtroom 7, the faint scent of polished wood and aging paper lingered, a familiar yet suffocating presence. Rows of rigid benches were occupied by silent observers, each feigning disinterest, yet unable to tear their gaze from the slender, trembling boy at the defendant's bench. Elijah Moore, just 17, seemed out of place against the severe backdrop of mahogany panels and marble floors. His suit, too large for his slight frame, hung awkwardly, its sleeves brushing his wrists as though borrowed from a distant relative. His hair was neatly trimmed, his shoes shined, but his lips were pressed into a thin line, the sole indicator of the tempest brewing behind his carefully composed expression. The charge was straightforward: theft of a luxury wristwatch. No fingerprints, no clear video, just the vague testimony of a store clerk and the heavy implication of guilt drawn from his skin color and his presence in that place. At the edge of the room, a man stood with his arms crossed, the silver badge on his chest catching the light with every shallow breath. Officer Marcus Reed was a figure molded from authority and intimidation. His uniform was immaculate, his jaw clenched so tightly that muscles twitched beneath his skin. Reed didn't need to speak to command the room. His mere presence was enough to force eyes downward, to still restless hands, to quell any hint of defiance. For over a decade he had been the undisputed enforcer in Chicago's East Side precincts, a man whose arrest record was the department's pride and the neighborhood's terror. He was a man unquestioned, undefied, until now. The courtroom's back door creaked open, a subtle sound, yet piercing in the profound silence. Heads turned, some out of curiosity, others from a habitual instinct to note any shift in the fragile equilibrium. Through the opening stepped a woman, clad in a sleek black trench coat, her heels softly clicking against the tile. She moved without haste, without apology, yet with a calm resolve that seemed almost unnatural in a place designed to intimidate. She carried no visible badge, no lawyer's briefcase, just a dark blue folder clutched tightly to her chest. For a moment no one recognized her. To the untrained eye, she was merely another black woman in a courtroom filled with shadows and unspoken assumptions. Reed's gaze flicked over her, dismissive, already bracing for whatever disruption her presence might cause. But she did not sit in the gallery. She did not join the defense table. She simply walked forward, each step deliberate, until she stood near the front, mere feet from the judge's bench. She stood there silently, her gaze fixed on Elijah, her eyes soft yet unyielding. It was Reed who spoke first, his voice sharp as a blade cutting through the tension. "You filthy, defending a thief? You're trash, all of you." His words echoed against the stone walls, eliciting a collective intake of breath from the gallery. In a swift, practiced motion he stepped forward, his booted foot rising in a blur, and with a calculated cruelty born from years of unchecked authority, he kicked the woman squarely in the chest. The impact sent her stumbling back into the front row, her folder scattering papers across the polished floor. A collective gasp rippled through the room, a sound half strangled by disbelief. Even the judge, long accustomed to the undercurrent of quiet violence in his courtroom, visibly paled for a moment. Time seemed to freeze, the air thickened, and the weight of unspoken histories hung heavy, as if the walls themselves struggled to contain the truth that had just been violently exposed. The woman rose slowly, not with the urgency of someone humiliated or broken, but with the calm precision of a person reclaiming her space. She gathered the scattered papers with hands that did not tremble. Then, standing tall, she held up a single document, its official seal glinting under the sterile courtroom lights. My name, she said, her voice clear and steady, resonating through the stunned silence, is Danielle Moore. As of this morning, I am the newly appointed chief of police for Chicago. The words landed in the room like a hammer blow, shattering the fragile veneer of control that Reed and others like him had maintained for years. His face drained of color, his jaw slackening as the reality of what he had just done, what he had revealed about himself, crashed down on him with a force no amount of badges or connections could deflect. Danielle's gaze locked with his, not with anger or triumph, but with a profound, almost painful clarity. It was the look of someone who had waited too long for justice, of someone who had carried the weight of a broken system on her shoulders and now stood not to plead for change but to demand it. She did not need to shout, to rage, to retaliate. Her very presence was a rupture in the careful choreography of silence and submission that had ruled this place for too long. Around them, the spectators sat frozen, their silence no longer one of complicity, but of awe, of disbelief that anyone had dared to shatter the unspoken rules that kept people like Danielle and Elijah silent and afraid. Even the judge, his gavel trembling in his hand, could not summon the courage to call for order. For in that instant order itself had been revealed as nothing more than a thin veneer masking the raw, unchecked violence of those who wielded power. Reed, once the master of this space, now found himself reduced to a figure stripped of authority, exposed not just for what he had done, but for the kind of man he had always been. His badge, his commendations, his years of service meant nothing against the weight of the truth Danielle had just laid bare. And in the stunned silence that followed, one chillingly undeniable truth became clear. Justice was no longer his to define. The courtroom, once a place of routine verdicts and rehearsed performances, had transformed into something raw and unpredictable, a stage where the real trial, the one long suppressed by fear and silence, was only just beginning. In the days that followed Danielle Moore's quiet but earth-shattering revelation, the world beyond Courtroom 7 was no longer silent. The image of Officer Marcus Reed, once the symbol of authority, pale and slack-jawed as Danielle rose from the floor, played on every screen and circulated through whispers across Chicago's tightly woven communities. But beneath the surface of collective outrage, a more insidious truth simmered. The silent machinery of the system Reed had long served. Danielle returned to the Chicago Police Headquarters that afternoon, not through the front steps where cameras and journalists clamored for a sound bite, but through the back, her black coat still dusty from the courtroom floor. The corridors, once pathways of camaraderie and compliance, felt heavy with unspoken questions. Officers who had exchanged nods with Reed only days before now avoided each other's gaze. Some dropped their eyes as Danielle passed. Others nodded, perhaps not in recognition but in a subtle acknowledgement that something immutable had shifted. In the quiet of her office, Danielle spread open the blue folder she had carried into the courtroom, the folder that now felt heavier with responsibility. It wasn't filled with strategies or promises. Instead, it contained complaint files, statements from those once dismissed, ignored, or quietly buried. These were voices like Elijah's, whose only crime had been standing too close to suspicion and whose pleas for fairness had been suffocated under procedure and prejudice. Danielle's fingers traced the topmost complaint. The faded ink of a woman's account describing a late-night stop, a search without cause, a shove into a squad car with no explanation. The report ended with a chilling note. No procedural violation observed. Case closed. Danielle knew that phrase too well. It had been the system's shield, its way of erasing wrongs before they could take root. But what Reed's public outburst had revealed was not just one man's arrogance. It was a glimpse into an entire structure that had thrived on silence and submission. She called in a small group of trusted officers, those who had watched her rise through the ranks, those who knew her not as a symbol but as a woman who had endured every subtle slight, every whispered doubt, and yet had chosen to stay. They gathered around her desk, their faces pale with realization as she laid out the files and spoke. This isn't about one bad officer. Reed wasn't a rogue element, he was a product. The phrase hung in the air, heavy as a verdict. Danielle continued, her voice steady. For years, we've been told to trust the system, to believe that justice is served when procedures are followed. But what happens when the procedure itself is the problem? When silence becomes the policy? The officers listened, some shifting uncomfortably, others nodding with grim understanding. They knew the system had cracks. They had seen officers with spotless records who managed to clear complaints with a signature, who delivered arrest numbers that looked good on paper but left communities broken and afraid. They had known but they had not spoken because speaking meant risking everything. Danielle, her jaw tightening, declared, "It's time we start asking the questions we were trained to avoid. Who approved Reed's promotions? Who signed off on complaints without follow-up? Who let this happen not just once but again and again, until Reed thought he could get away with it even in a courtroom?" The team began tracing records, not with the intent of building a case against Reed alone, but to uncover the architecture of silence he had leaned on. They unearthed files from the Internal Affairs Department, documents marked with dates that coincided suspiciously with Reed's commendations. They found logs of arrests where witnesses were never contacted, evidence was misplaced, reports were filed late or not at all. Each discovery was like pulling a thread that led deeper into a tapestry woven with complicity. Danielle called it what it was: a machine. A machine designed not to correct injustice, but to maintain an illusion of order, she said. Reed wasn't its creator. He was merely its most visible gear. Her words rang through the office, where officers now shifted from quiet complicity to cautious determination. Files that had once gathered dust were reopened. Names of civilians once written off were spoken aloud. Danielle insisted on creating a civilian review board, not as a token gesture but as a shield against the return of silence. She brought in data analysts, community leaders, even legal scholars from the University of Chicago, determined to rebuild oversight from the ground up. What frightened her team was not the evidence they found, but the realization that the system had been designed to erase it. Complaints were filtered through coded language. Reports were quietly resolved without clear outcomes, and officers with the highest arrest rates were, paradoxically, the ones praised as outstanding. Every detail pointed to a culture where speed, not fairness, was the metric of success. Danielle's quiet resolve did not waver. In a private meeting with city officials, she presented her findings, not with the fury of a public spectacle but with the cold clarity of facts that could no longer be ignored. She spoke of patterns of repeated failures, of voices silenced by bureaucracy. She demanded, not requested, that a task force be established to audit not just cases linked to Reed, but the entire ecosystem of unchecked authority. Some officials hesitated, wary of the political fallout, but Danielle's calm insistence, paired with the public's rising demand for accountability, left them no refuge. "If we don't address this," she warned, her voice low but firm, "we're not just complicit, we're accomplices." In the quiet that followed, the weight of her words settled like dust over old files and stale policies. One official, shifting uncomfortably, finally murmured, "You're not just unmasking Reed, you're unmasking us." Danielle's response was soft but resolute. "That's the point. It's not about revenge, it's about reckoning." And with that she left the meeting, not as a symbol of triumph but as a quiet force willing to stare down a machine that had for too long been content to grind people like Elijah into silence. What she had begun was no longer just a case. It was a movement, one that would force Chicago to confront not just one corrupt officer, but the legacy of a system built on fear, erasure, and the quiet hum of a machine designed to survive unchallenged. It wasn't just the halls of the police station that felt different in the weeks following Danielle Moore's quiet declaration and the mounting investigation into the legacy of Marcus Reed. Something subtle but undeniable began to shift in the very heart of Chicago. It started in whispers between neighbors, in cautious nods exchanged between those who had once kept their heads down. People who had long accepted the silence as inevitable found themselves staring it in the face, questioning why they had ever believed it was unbreakable. At a community center in Bronzeville, a neighborhood long marked by systemic neglect and thinly veiled surveillance, the seeds of resistance quietly took root. Organizers gathered late into the evenings, their discussions tinged with a mix of frustration and fragile hope. Among them was Lisa Deere, a local schoolteacher who had grown tired of watching her students punished more harshly for minor infractions than their white counterparts from wealthier districts. She remembered Reed's face from stories her students told, from news blurbs that never quite named the injustices outright but hinted at them enough for her to know. Lisa wasn't a firebrand by nature, but she felt a fire rising in her that she could no longer ignore. One night, under the soft hum of flickering overhead lights, she stood before the group, her voice quivering yet firm. "We've spent too long waiting for someone else to fix this. Danielle can't do it alone. The system isn't going to save us. It never was. But we can stand beside her and we can start right here. Her words weren't dramatic, but they cut through the quiet like a blade. In that moment, others stepped forward. Small business owners, retired city workers, a pastor who had seen too many young men from his congregation buried too soon. They weren't politicians or legal experts, but they were the pulse of the city's forgotten neighborhoods. Together, they decided to form a citizen oversight network, not in competition with Danielle's internal reforms, but as a grassroots complement. Their plan was simple: to collect stories, document abuses, and offer legal support to victims too afraid to come forward on their own. They called themselves the Watch. It wasn't a name born from bravado but from a simple truth. They were tired of waiting to be protected. They would be the ones watching now. As the Watch began to grow, Danielle noticed its ripple effect. Complaints began surfacing from corners of the city that had once been silent. People who had been resigned to their fates, young mothers, elderly men, undocumented workers, found quiet allies willing to listen and document. Danielle met with Lisa and her team privately, offering not official endorsement but quiet encouragement. "This isn't about rebellion," she told them. "It's about reclaiming our dignity. You're doing what the system should have done a long time ago." Lisa nodded, her eyes reflecting both gratitude and determination. "We know. And we're ready." Beyond community centers, the seeds of resistance spread into the cultural veins of the city. Spoken word poets and street artists began weaving the story of Danielle's confrontation with Reed into murals and verses that caught fire on social media. A local musician released a haunting ballad that layered news audio of Reed's courtroom outburst over a slow, aching melody. It wasn't just art, it was testimony, raw and unflinching, and it found its audience in those who had long felt invisible. The universities too stirred. Law students at DePaul University organized a symposium dissecting the structural failures exposed by Danielle's investigation, inviting community voices to speak alongside professors. At one session, a young woman named Marisol Torres stood up, her voice trembling but clear. "When I was a kid, I saw my father stopped by officers like Reed. No evidence, no explanation. And I watched my mother tell him to stay quiet, to come home safe. I thought silence was survival. But now I see it's surrender. And I'm done surrendering." Her words ignited a standing ovation, not because they were polished or grand, but because they rang with a truth everyone in that room recognized. Silence had once been armor, but it had also been a cage. Danielle's quiet rebellion had shown them the lock. Now people were reaching for the key. In the quiet corners of the city, in barber shops and laundromats, the conversation shifted. It wasn't just about outrage anymore. It was about accountability, about solidarity, about refusing to let the system erase their stories again. Even those who had once called Marcus Reed a hero for his tough-on-crime approach began to question what they had believed. Was it justice, or was it just fear wrapped in a badge? Danielle watched these ripples with a mixture of pride and caution. She knew how easily hope could be co-opted, how quickly the system might offer a few symbolic changes to silence the rising voices. But she also knew that something fundamental had been set in motion. This wasn't a flash of protest destined to fade. It was a seedbed of resistance. Imperfect, fragile, but growing. As autumn winds swept through Chicago's streets, leaves turning and falling in slow cascades, the city itself seemed to lean into the change. It wasn't loud or sudden. It was the quiet insistence of a people remembering that their voices mattered, that justice wasn't something bestowed from above, but demanded from below. And at the heart of it all stood Danielle, not as a savior but as a reminder. The real power was never in the badge or the bench. It was and always had been in the people's refusal to be silent. As the days turned into weeks, Chicago's air thickened with a tension both exhilarating and suffocating. Danielle Moore, once an enigma even to herself, was now a symbol. Not because she sought attention but because she refused to look away. The echoes of that kick, so brazen, so public, so revealing, had transformed her from a cautious administrator into an unrelenting force. But the fight was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the city and to every person who had once looked the other way, convinced the system was too big to change. Behind closed doors, Reed's empire of influence was unraveling. Investigations unearthed hidden files, payments buried in innocuous budget lines, and complaints dismissed without review. But it wasn't just paperwork and policy that Danielle and her quiet network of allies were up against. It was the deeply ingrained culture of silence that had for generations taught people to endure, to keep their heads down and to survive by staying quiet. And now for the first time that silence was cracking. It began with the testimonies, at first just a few voices, tremulous with the weight of long-held secrets, their words halting as though stepping into unknown territory. A retired bus driver recounted how his nephew was arrested for resisting after asking an officer why he was being stopped. A nurse, soft-spoken and tired, described the bruises on her husband's arms that never made it into any report. Each story was like a chisel against the wall of silence, and as more stories emerged, it became clear that this wasn't an isolated pattern. It was a strategy honed and perpetuated through unspoken agreements and unchecked power. Danielle found herself in the middle of these confessions, listening with a patience born not of training but of necessity. Each account, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, was a thread in the larger fabric of a city's reckoning. She catalogued names, dates, descriptions, tiny shards of evidence that alone might have seemed dismissible, but together formed a mosaic of systemic abuse. But it wasn't just the victims who began speaking. Officers who had once worked under Reed's shadow, some complicit, others trapped by circumstance, found their courage. In hushed tones and encrypted messages, they confessed to the unspoken rules. Quotas not officially sanctioned but understood, pressure to produce arrests in high-crime zones, and the subtle punishments for those who refused to play along. One junior officer, barely into his third year, wept as he described being ordered to falsify reports. "I knew it was wrong," he admitted, "but I thought I was protecting my job, my family." Danielle didn't judge. She knew too well the quiet desperation of those caught in a system where speaking out meant risking everything. Instead, she offered a path forward, a promise that their confessions would be documented, that their truths would be protected, and that they wouldn't be abandoned to face the backlash alone. This growing wave of testimony did more than crack the wall of silence. It reshaped the city's collective memory. Suddenly, conversation shifted from whispers of helplessness to declarations of intent. Community meetings, once sparsely attended, were now overflowing. Residents demanded to know not just what would be done, but who had allowed the abuses to continue for so long. Local news outlets, initially hesitant, began airing unfiltered stories from neighborhoods that had long been ignored. Footage of Danielle's confrontation with Reed replayed on every major channel, but now it was accompanied by interviews with those whose experiences echoed hers, each voice lending depth and gravity to the narrative. What set this movement apart wasn't its noise but its clarity. Danielle refused to let it spiral into empty outrage or performative activism. Instead, she insisted on precision, detailed documentation, verified accounts, and a framework for real accountability. She convened independent panels comprising not just legal experts but community members, educators, clergy, and even youth leaders. Their mandate was clear: review every complaint filed over the past 2 decades, identify patterns of misconduct, and trace the line of responsibility not just to individuals but to the very structures that enabled them. In the basement of an old library, repurposed into a community archive, volunteers sorted through mountains of forgotten files. Each dusty report, each neglected complaint, was a testament to resilience. As one volunteer put it, these papers aren't just records, they're the voices of everyone who was told they didn't matter. Danielle spent hours there herself, sleeves rolled up, reading page after page with a focus so intense that those around her hesitated to interrupt. The work was slow, painstaking, and often disheartening. For every breakthrough, there were files so heavily redacted they seemed impenetrable. For every confession, there was a counter-narrative crafted to obscure the truth. But through it all, Danielle's resolve never wavered. She knew the weight of what they were uncovering wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about restoring dignity to those who had been dismissed, silenced, and erased. Then came the moment that made the entire city pause. At a town hall meeting, streamed live and watched by thousands, a middle-aged woman named Evelyn Grant stepped forward. Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. "My son was one of those you never saw," she said, her words cutting through the room like a blade. "He died in custody and they said it was an accident. But I knew it wasn't. I've been carrying this for 10 years and I'm done being silent." Her testimony ignited something visceral. People stood, applauded, some wept. In that moment, it became undeniable that the silence wasn't born of apathy. It was born of fear, cultivated over years by those who benefited from it. And now, fear was giving way to collective defiance. In response, Danielle launched a public platform, the Living Archive, where anyone could submit their story, anonymously if necessary, to be included in a growing digital repository of testimonials. It wasn't just about accountability, it was about ownership, about letting people see that their experiences weren't isolated. They were part of a pattern that demanded acknowledgement and redress. This was how the wall of silence finally began to break, not with a single blow but with the steady, unrelenting pressure of truth. Danielle knew they were still far from justice. There were still forces, powerful and entrenched, that would resist, retaliate, and try to rewrite the narrative. But the difference now was clear. Silence was no longer a refuge for the complicit. It was a battleground, and for the first time in a generation, it was being contested by those who refused to be silenced any longer. In the wake of the storm, as the dust of revelations settled over Chicago, Danielle Moore stood before a new horizon, one not merely painted by the stories of past injustice, but illuminated by the fragile, determined glow of possibility. 4 months, she had been the center of a story she never intended to tell, a reluctant protagonist forced into the role by a system too broken to fix itself. Now, as the city grappled with its own reckoning, it was no longer about her. It was about what came next. The public outrage had reached such a pitch that even those who had once turned a blind eye found themselves questioning their silence. Elected officials who had once praised Reed's efficiency were now aligning themselves with calls for reform, not out of sudden enlightenment, but because they could no longer afford to ignore the shifting tide of public will. For Danielle, however, the measure of success was never in press releases or public declarations. It was in the quiet moments. The mother who no longer feared retaliation for speaking up. The officer who returned to the precinct not to enforce silence but to protect truth. The young people who now saw their futures as something worth fighting for. She implemented a new framework for oversight, one that extended beyond mere transparency. The Root Review Board, an independent body comprising community advocates, former defendants, and civil rights attorneys, was granted real authority. No longer would complaints be filed into voids. Now every grievance would be answered, not with a sterile letter but with action. Real consequences for misconduct, retraining for systemic failures, and above all, acknowledgement of those who had been harmed. The very first case the board reviewed resulted in the dismissal of an officer whose actions mirrored Reed's pattern of abuse. It was a moment both cathartic and sobering, a sign that this was only the beginning. Danielle knew she could not dismantle decades of corruption overnight, but she could plant seeds of integrity so deep that even the most entrenched forces could not uproot them. She met with educators to integrate civic rights into school curricula, ensuring that future generations understood not just their rights but their responsibilities in holding systems accountable. She championed a public data initiative where police interactions, community feedback, and complaint outcomes were posted monthly for all to see. No redactions, no delays, no hidden agendas. And she did all of this not to gain accolades, but because she believed that justice wasn't a destination. It was a practice, a discipline, a commitment to facing hard truths every day. What changed was not the city's skyline, nor the polished statements of officials. What changed was the way people walked through the streets. No longer did they avert their eyes when passing a patrol car. No longer did the murmur of fear accompany every stop, every checkpoint. Children played outside without parents glancing nervously at the corner, and old neighbors began to share stories without whispering. In these small acts, the city was healing. Perhaps the most striking shift was in the faces of those who once bore the weight of silence. Evelyn Grant, the mother whose words had once cracked the courtroom walls, now led a community support network for families navigating the justice system. She became a mentor to those struggling with the trauma of lost loved ones, turning her pain into a wellspring of hope. Young voices, once dismissed as naive, were now part of advisory panels shaping policy. And amidst it all, Danielle remained quietly in the background, a steady presence who reminded everyone that the fight wasn't over, but it was at last being fought. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the towering silhouette of the city, casting long shadows over the streets where so many stories had been silenced, Danielle stood alone on the steps of the community center. She watched as neighbors gathered for an open forum, a scene that would have been unthinkable just months before. Laughter mingled with serious discussions, old tensions giving way to a cautious collective hope. She realized then that change wasn't about erasing the past, it was about carrying it forward with clarity and purpose, ensuring it could never be forgotten, never repeated. As she turned to leave, a young girl no more than 10 tugged at her sleeve and said softly, "Thank you for making it safe to tell the truth." Danielle smiled, a rare, genuine expression of peace, and knelt to meet the girl's eyes. "You make it safe," she whispered back. "You and everyone who dares to speak up." In that moment, Danielle Moore understood something profound. That justice was not a prize to be won, but a light to be passed from hand to hand, from generation to generation. And as long as there were those willing to carry it, no amount of darkness could ever truly extinguish it. Danielle Moore's journey epitomizes quiet resilience, fierce integrity, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Her story began with a courtroom moment so explosive it ignited a city. A single kick, a blatant act of disrespect and violence captured in chilling clarity. Yet what followed was not the familiar retreat into silence or complicity. Instead, it became the initial fracture in a long-standing wall of systemic injustice that had thrived in the shadows. Danielle's confrontation with Officer Reed wasn't merely about a personal vendetta. It served as a catalyst, revealing the deep-seated rot within Chicago's justice system. Here, power was often wielded without accountability, and those meant to serve and protect instead oppressed and silenced. Through each stage of her struggle, from unearthing buried complaints to establishing independent review boards and challenging entrenched authority, Danielle illuminated a path not just for herself, but for her entire community. She understood that justice couldn't be confined to courtroom walls or legal documents. It had to live in daily practices of fairness, in the willingness to listen to long-ignored voices, and in the courage to face uncomfortable truths head-on. She advocated for a justice that wasn't solely about punishing individuals as examples, but about rebuilding a system where transparency and accountability were non-negotiable. Her transformation from a targeted Black woman to a symbol of integrity didn't rely on loud declarations or dramatic gestures. Rather, it was her steady, deliberate choices, releasing case data to the public, creating educational initiatives, inviting community voices into oversight positions, that truly redefined what justice could look like in her city. The impact rippled far beyond Chicago, reaching other cities grappling with similar challenges, offering them not just hope, but a tangible model for reform. It stands as a testament to the power of one voice, backed by the persistence to fight against seemingly insurmountable odds, igniting a movement that reshaped an entire system. From Danielle's story, we learn that the fight for justice is not an event but a continuous process. A commitment to speaking out even when no one listens, to standing firm even when the ground trembles, and to believing in the possibility of change even when it seems impossible. It teaches us that silence, though it may feel like survival, is never the answer. We all have a role to play, whether by amplifying marginalized voices, holding our institutions accountable, or educating ourselves and others on the systemic injustices that persist today. In our everyday lives, this means asking tougher questions, refusing to accept superficial solutions, and remembering that justice is as much about prevention as it is about correction. It's about creating spaces where truth is safe to speak and ensuring that power is always checked by accountability. And when faced with moments where silence feels easier, we must remember Danielle's resilience, that even one voice can disrupt cycles of injustice, and one determined heart can light the path for countless others. If Danielle's story has inspired you, moved you, or given you a new perspective, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that challenge, inspire, and empower. Together, we can keep these conversations alive and build a future where justice isn't just an idea, but a reality for all. Thank you for being part of this journey. Stay tuned for more.